Travis, you belong to the mechanical keyboard generation, keeping it out of habit.
Habit has its price, Raymond, especially when it operates the entire system you rely on.
The insult came through the ceiling speakers flat, casual, and slicing straight through the frozen air of the server room. Travis belongs to the mechanical keyboard generation. We keep him around out of habit. The words landed harder than the metal floor under my boots. I didn't move. I just stared at the simulation logs for the Department of Defense test I'd been patching for the last 3 hours, the cold air biting into my fingers like tiny needles. The server racks hummed around me, my only witnesses, as a heat I didn't feel climbed up my neck and stalled in my throat. That was our CFO, Raymond Hale, speaking to the entire operations floor upstairs. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but in this building, sound had a way of traveling, especially when it wasn't meant to. If you've ever been there, tell me where you're listening from right now. I'd love to hear your story too. And hey, I have to say this with a smile, about 95% of you are listening without hitting subscribe. It's okay, I won't take it personally, but if you're enjoying this ride, tapping that button really helps keep the stories going. Back to the story. A vibration brushed my hip. My phone lit up with a new email, Annual Performance Review Compensation Adjustment. I opened it with the numb familiarity of a man checking a wound he already knew was infected. Bonus deferred. For the 6th year in a row. I exhaled once, slow. Thin, 50 years old. A worn lower back, elevated blood pressure I kept ignoring, and a daughter who barely spoke to me because I'd missed every school milestone for critical deployments. My ex-wife used to joke that I wasn't married to her. I was married to ApexFort. Eventually, she stopped joking. Another vibration, another email. But this one wasn't meant for me. It was a forwarded slide deck, CFO only, access accidentally CC'd to my address. My thumb hesitated, then tapped. A single line glared back at me, highlighted in company red: overperformer, underpaid, zero flight risk, no explanation, no apology. Just a metrics-based autopsy of my value. I stood there, frozen, just a middle-aged man in a refrigerated steel room, my breath caught somewhere between anger and humiliation. The only thing that moved was my right hand, trembling slightly from the cold. But my eyes sharpened, because at 4:17 p.m., something finally snapped quietly back into place. Looking back, it's almost funny how quickly a decade can disappear when you're too busy keeping everyone else's world from collapsing. Between 40 and 48. My life became a long blur of status lights, overnight deployments, and emergency simulations for the Department of Defense. Somewhere in that blur were 4 consecutive birthdays my daughter celebrated without me. I still remember the last one I missed. She sent me a photo of her cake with a single line, maybe next year. Dad? Turns out next year arrived only after she stopped asking. Before ApexFort. I'd served as a technical specialist in the military, nothing glamorous. Just enough time in uniform to understand what real risk looked like. When I pivoted into defense tech, I believed I was doing something honorable. I told myself building risk simulation systems would protect the men and women who still wore the same boots I once did. Back then, I worked with purpose, not desperation. ApexFort knew exactly how to use that purpose. They dangled equity like a carrot on a very long stick, shares that would increase in value once the system launches, bonuses that would align with your impact, and promises whispered in hallways about leadership roles someday. Someday never came, but the work did, mountains of it piled on my shoulders while they crafted visions of the future in boardrooms I wasn't invited into. When the company finally struck gold, everything changed except my paycheck. The founders traded their hoodies for designer suits, swapped battered Hondas for silent electric cars, and moved into a high-rise office with a lobby that smelled like citrus and money. Meanwhile, I was still cramming late-night fixes into my aging backpack, sneaking down the stairwell because the executives didn't want technical staff crowding their new glass elevators. A funny detail. If you enjoy dark humor, HR Melissa once pulled me aside, her voice dripping with that manufactured empathy HR departments buy in bulk. Travis, at your age, being kept on this long is already a blessing, she said. Blessing. As if I should thank them for the privilege of being underpaid while propping up their entire empire. I nodded politely, because that was my role, nodding politely while swallowing whatever pride I had left. But the real punchline didn't arrive until months later. When I finally dug out my original employment contract from a dusty metal box in my closet, I read it once, twice, 3 times each pass colder than the last. The contract was flimsy. Rushed. Barely 2 pages. And missing the single clause every tech company depends on. There was no intellectual property assignment, no transfer of invention rights, no ownership language at all. In the end, all those years they took from me had left one final. Exquisite irony, the entire system they built their fortune on was still legally mine. By the time I got home that night, the city felt quieter than usual. Too quiet. As if it already knew something I didn't. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. It wasn't comforting. It was heavy, like a thick blanket soaked in cold water. Eventually. I walked to my desk, reached under it, and pulled out the old laptop I hadn't touched in years. It was 11 years old, scratched around the edges, and still had a piece of tape from the move after my divorce. I opened it, half expecting it to refuse to boot, but the screen flickered, hummed, and came to life with that familiar glow I used to fall asleep to during those years when my entire life fit into one small apartment back then. I wrote most of the core engine on my kitchen table while my wife and daughter slept down the hall, quiet nights powered by stale coffee and a belief that building something meaningful would make all the sacrifice worth it. I clicked through the old folders. The path names felt like ghosts brushing past me. Then I opened the original repository. The commit history appeared line by line, timestamp after timestamp, all predating ApexFort's founding by months. I remembered the nights tied to each entry, hands numb from coding, eyes burning, whispering to myself that someday it would all pay off. Now, staring at those logs, the realization hit like a slow, suffocating wave. They weren't just underpaying me, they were using something that never legally belonged to them. I leaned back and glanced at the framed photo on the corner of my desk, my daughter at her high school graduation. Cap tilted, smiling toward a crowd I wasn't in. That was the year I deployed a major patch for ApexFort's first government test. I told myself I'd make it up to her someday. Someday is another word for never. When you're 50 and running on borrowed energy. My chest tightened, not anger, not panic, just a hollow pressure like standing in an empty warehouse. Too old to start over, too skilled to keep being treated like a shadow. It was a cruel intersection to stand at. That's when my phone buzzed. A message from the attorney I'd consulted days earlier under federal law. If you built the core outside company time and equipment, they may be using your software without proper rights. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt. ApexFort wasn't just exploiting me. They were trespassing on my life's work, and in that cold, dim light of my apartment, the truth finally settled. Everything I thought I'd lost was still mine. Once the truth settled, it didn't ignite anger the way I expected. It sharpened me. There's a strange clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping for fairness and start planning for consequences. So the next morning, I walked into ApexFort with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose and nothing left to give for free. I didn't storm into offices or confront anyone. I did something far more effective. I opened a new branch in our system's codebase and named it something no executive would ever bother reading. The title alone was a perfect disguise. Cross-Domain Auditability Layer DoD Compliance v3.7. The kind of bureaucratic jargon that made non-technical people glaze over. It sounded boring, tedious, and painfully essential. In other words, the perfect Trojan horse. The concept was simple. A distributed access control mechanism disguised as a security enhancement. It wasn't built to break the system. Breaking things is loud, messy, and easy to trace. This was designed to pause it to stop the heart without tampering with a single artery. A cardiac freeze, a silent lock waiting for one thing, only validation from a token issued by a server I alone controlled. I drafted the proposal carefully, no red flags, no unusual language, nothing that hinted at the reality underneath. Then I scheduled a meeting with CFO Raymond, my manager, and one compliance representative. Raymond walked in late, scrolling his phone, already bored before the presentation even started. That made it even easier. I presented diagrams, flowcharts, and a handful of acronyms I knew he wouldn't understand. Every time I said Langley Audit Protocol, he nodded as if I'd personally briefed him at the Pentagon. When I mentioned federal interoperability standards, he straightened his tie. By the time I finished, he was convinced I was saving the company from a future compliance nightmare. He approved the initiative on the spot. He never asked what the system would do if validation failed. Executives rarely ask the right questions. Over the next 6 weeks, I rolled out the microlocks one by one. Each module: risk simulation, prediction engine, conflict modeling, transaction intake received a tiny piece of the distributed mechanism. Nothing suspicious, nothing large, just small. Harmless-looking audit scripts sliding neatly into place. The beauty was in the subtlety. Each microlock checked for one thing: an external heartbeat generated by my private server. If the token was present and current, the system operated flawlessly. If not, it didn't crash, didn't alert, didn't destroy. It simply waited, an endless, patient pause that no amount of debugging could fix, while others worked on flashy new features. I was quietly wrapping the entire ApexFort engine in a digital exoskeleton only I understood. And the best part, no one noticed. No alarms, no questions, no raised eyebrows. Just the silent, methodical installation of control. By the time the final component deployed, the lock was complete. ApexFort hadn't gained a new security module. It had gained a heartbeat, and I held the only pulse. The morning of the quarterly review arrived with the same hollow sense of routine I'd grown used to. But this time, there was a sharpness beneath it, quiet, controlled, and simmering. By the time I reached the executive floor, my reflection in the glass wall looked like a man walking into a courtroom, not a performance meeting. The conference room itself was a cathedral of polished wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kind of stillness designed to make people feel small. It worked on me, but only for a moment. CFO Raymond Hale sat at the head of the table, flipping casually through a tablet. HR lead Melissa Crown perched beside him with her leather-bound portfolio, rehearsed empathy already painted across her face. My manager, poor Tommy Archer, looked like he'd swallowed a thumbtack. The room went quiet when I took my seat. The review started the usual way: charts, metrics, green arrows, praise for system stability, applause for the flawless simulations I had delivered for the Department of Defense. I listened with the same detached politeness I'd perfected over the years. But then the script changed. Raymond set the tablet down and leaned back, his expression cooling into something far less performative. "Let's get to the real issue," he said. "You're asking for compensation adjustments." His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. "But from a business standpoint, why should we pay you more when you continue to produce at a discount?" The words hit harder than he intended, or maybe exactly as he intended. My hands tightened under the table, not enough to shake, just enough to remind myself I was still human. I felt 50 years of sacrifice pressing against my ribs: the missed birthdays, the late nights, the pride I'd buried just to keep this machine alive. And now, here I was reduced to a bargain bin asset. Before I could respond, Melissa slid a neatly stapled contract across the table. "We've prepared a refreshed agreement for you," she said. "A 2% increase effective next quarter." She said it like she expected applause, but I already knew what was inside. Page 37, subsection 9, the intellectual property assignment. Everything I had ever built signed away for a raise that wouldn't cover inflation. I stared at the document, not reading it, just looking at the symbol of what they thought I was worth. They believed age made me desperate. They believed loyalty meant compliance. They believed I would swallow this insult like all the others. For a moment, my throat tightened with something hot: rage, disappointment, betrayal, all tangled together, but it never reached the surface. Instead, a calmness settled over me, sharper than any anger I'd ever felt. Slowly, I reached into my bag. 3 sets of eyes followed my hand. I pulled out a plain white envelope and placed it gently atop the contract. "My resignation," I said quietly. No theatrics, no explanation. Then I stood, turned, and walked out of the glass room, leaving them frozen in a silence they didn't know how to break. Leaving the glass conference room felt nothing like defeat. If anything, it felt like stepping out of a pressure chamber I'd been trapped in for years. The hallway was silent as I walked toward the elevator. No congratulations, no farewells, not even curious stares, just the soft hum of the building pretending everything was normal. When the elevator doors slid shut, the quiet inside felt like the world taking one long, cleansing breath. I pulled out my phone, no hesitation, no trembling, just a simple, deliberate motion. I opened the administrative panel for the external authorization server I controlled, found ApexFort's production cluster on the whitelist, and swiped left. Remove. A confirmation flashed for half a second, then disappeared. That was it. Nothing dramatic. No alarms. Just a company losing the right to its own heartbeat. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft chime. I stepped out, pushed through the rotating doors, and let the cold air fill my lungs. It was sharper than I expected, biting at my cheeks, but it kept me awake steady, grounded, instead of calling a cab. I started walking. 2 kilometers, not far, but far enough to let the tension bleed out through my steps. The wind tugged at my coat. My shoulders leaned forward under the weight of years. But there was something new in my stride, a lightness, a clarity. I'd spent half my life gripping the edges of a sinking ship, terrified of what would happen if I let go, now that I finally had. I felt calm, not triumphant, not angry, just calm. My building was quiet when I reached it. I climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, letting the rhythm settle my thoughts. Inside my apartment, I hung up my coat, took a breath, and pulled out my phone again, this time for a different reason. My thumb hovered over my daughter's name. I should call her. I thought I should tell her I finally walked away, that I wasn't choosing work over her anymore. I started the call and ended it before it rang. I wasn't ready, not yet. I needed to steady my own voice before I tried to fix what I'd broken years ago. I set the phone down on the table and glanced at the clock. 2:59 p.m. A single minute passed like a held breath. Then 3 o'clock. I opened the monitoring dashboard on my laptop. At first, nothing seemed different. Then the logs began updating, each line marking the moment the system reached for its renewal token and didn't get one. Request denied, request denied, request denied, no smoke, no fire, no crash reports. ApexFort's billion-dollar engine simply stopped accepting new processes. It didn't scream. It didn't flinch. It just went still. A quiet war had begun, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. If there's one thing I've learned after decades in defense tech, it's that when something truly catastrophic happens, the panic doesn't start with screaming. It starts with silence, the kind just sharp enough to cut through walls, and sometime around 9:15 the next morning, that silence rolled through ApexFort like a shockwave. The first calls hit their operations line before the coffee machines even warmed up. Contractors from the Air Combat Simulation Unit reported full tactical freezes. The Navy's wargame scheduler flagged total system inactivity. A Northern Command liaison reportedly shouted into the phone, demanding to know why every predictive model they relied on had suddenly flatlined. By 10 o'clock, half of the nation's defense contractors were on hold, listening to ApexFort's automated message reassuring them that their call's important. I almost choked on my drink when I imagined the expression on Raymond's face. Upstairs, chaos bloomed like a wildfire. I heard the version of events later from Jenna Ruiz, the bright young engineer I'd mentored, one of the few decent souls in the building, according to her. The command center looked like someone had pulled the plug on an anthill. CFO Raymond Hale was apparently red-faced and sweating, shouting orders no one could follow. HR lead Melissa Crown was rushing from desk to desk, demanding to know who had access to what, as if the right spreadsheet could magically resurrect a dead engine. And poor Jenna. She said she stared at her monitor while tens of thousands of log entries flooded in, all of them showing the same message in identical gray text: service unavailable, service unavailable, service unavailable. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my kitchen, watching the same catastrophe unfold from a very different vantage point. My laptop was open on the table beside a warm mug of coffee, and my private server log scrolled down the screen in soothing, repeating lines: access denied, access denied, access denied. It was almost rhythmic, peaceful, even. A soft drumbeat marking the collapse of a company that thought I'd always stay quiet. I sipped my coffee and couldn't help the faint smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. Not triumph, not revenge exactly, just the satisfaction of watching cause finally meet effect. Around 11, my inbox pinged. For a moment, I assumed it was Jenna. It wasn't. It was Melissa. The subject line was as dramatic as her personality. Immediate action required federal security breach. The message inside accused me by name of malicious interference in national defense infrastructure, demanded I appear at the office immediately, and claimed ApexFort had evidence of wrongdoing. The email ended with a thinly veiled legal threat. I stared at it for a long second. Then opened my voicemail app and replayed the message I'd saved from Raymond. His voice spilled out, irritated and careless. Our system, the one we own entirely. He said it twice. Ownership, full ownership. His words, not mine. And the best part, completely untrue. I leaned back in my chair, took another sip of coffee, and let the irony settle. ApexFort wanted to threaten me over a crime I didn't commit using software that didn't belong to them. And the funniest part, they still hadn't realized the real breach was their arrogance. The summons to the emergency board meeting arrived just after noon, short, clipped, and carrying the kind of urgency ApexFort usually reserved for missile drills. I knew exactly why they wanted me there, and for the first time in years, I didn't walk into that building feeling like an employee. I walked in like a man holding the detonator they didn't know existed. 2 security guards flanked the boardroom doors, inside. The atmosphere felt scorched like the oxygen had been sucked out. Every director was already seated, their faces carved with panic lines deep enough to map. CFO Raymond Hale stood near the corner, trying to defend himself to a stone-faced chairman. But the moment I stepped through the door, the chairman lifted his hand. "Mr. Hale, you can wait outside." Raymond blinked, stunned. I'm the CFO. I should outside, the chairman repeated, sharper this time. Watching him shuffle out lip tight, ego deflating was a small pleasure I didn't bother hiding. I took my seat across from them. My attorney, a calm, silver-haired woman named Ruth Barrett, set her briefcase on the table and clicked it open. What she pulled out wasn't dramatic, just a neat stack of documents, each clipped with quiet precision, but the effect on the room was immediate. Everyone leaned in as if bracing for impact. Ruth began, "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are currently experiencing is not a system malfunction, it is a permissions failure." She slid the first document forward. "These are the original commit logs for the ApexFort tactical engine created by Mr. Travis Cole before this company legally existed." Murmurs rippled across the table. Next came a copy of my original employment contract. "As you can see," she continued, tapping her finger on the final paragraph, "there is no intellectual property assignment clause." Then the email, the one where Raymond proudly proclaimed ApexFort's complete ownership of the system. The room went dead still as the words glowed on the screen. "And finally," Ruth said, "under federal law, ApexFort is presently using a defense-related software asset it does not legally own. That constitutes unlicensed deployment of national security infrastructure." A director near the end of the table, a man in his late 60s, pressed a trembling hand against his mouth. We may have committed a federal offense." The dread in his voice seemed to spread, tightening the air until nobody dared make eye contact with anyone else. That's when I spoke. Calm. Straightforward. "I didn't bring this to punish you, but I will not allow my work to be used without my authorization." The chairman inhaled sharply. "What do you want, Mr. Yock Cole?" I placed a folder on the table, inside a signed memorandum of understanding. "I've already reached a preliminary agreement with Titan Forge," I said. "They're ready to launch an advanced engine built from my original design. All they need is my final approval." The entire board recoiled as if slapped for the first time in the company's history. ApexFort wasn't holding the power. I was, and the firestorm that followed wasn't chaos. It was control finally, unmistakably, mine. The boardroom didn't explode the way movies like to show. No shouting, no fists on the table, no dramatic walkouts. The real collapse of a corporation sounds more like a long exhale, the kind people make when they finally understand the consequences of their own arrogance. After reviewing every document, every timestamp, every clause they should have cared about 10 years ago. ApexFort had only one option left. They capitulated. The chairman was the first to speak after the hour-long silence. His voice trembled in a way that suggested he'd aged a decade since the meeting started. "Mr. Cole, we acknowledge your ownership of the intellectual property. Not we support, not we agree, but acknowledge like they were identifying a truth they'd tried very hard to ignore." Ruth, my attorney, remained expressionless. I simply nodded. The next line item came from the legal team, who looked like they'd all swallowed cold metal. "ApexFort will pay $1.8 million in back pay and licensing fees, effective immediately." They said it mechanically, but the tension in the room told another story. That number wasn't pulled from thin air. It represented every promise the company had broken. Every night I spent coding alone, every year they pretended I was expendable, and the chairman added slowly. We respectfully request a temporary 90-day license to continue system operations while we transition. Ah, there it was. The admission they needed me more than I ever needed them. I agreed not out of mercy, but out of practicality. The military clients deserved stability, and the cleanest way to deliver that was a structured transition period. Still, I couldn't help the quiet satisfaction curling in my chest as I signed the license agreement with a steady hand. Raymond Hale wasn't present when the final signatures were made. He'd been escorted out of the building hours earlier, terminated effective immediately. I didn't see it happen, but I pictured his expression anyway, and the image alone was enough to bring a calm, measured warmth to the room. HR Melissa resigned 48 hours later. Citing personal reasons, I didn't bother to correct anyone when all was said and signed. I walked out of the building with a folder under my arm, and the kind of silence that comes after a storm has broken everything except your resolve. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, deeper, like a slow recognition of my own worth returning after years of being buried. At home. I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and entered the authorization key ApexFort had paid for. 90 days, a fixed countdown. But here was the twist: they didn't know the key I sent them unlocked the old version stable. Functional, but frozen in time. Titanforge, on the other hand, had already received the new engine 30% faster, infinitely cleaner, and designed with the freedom I never had at ApexFort as the code deployed smoothly on Titanforge's systems. I leaned back and let the soft satisfaction settle. ApexFort finally recognized me, but Titanforge valued me. Starting over at 50 doesn't look the way people imagine. It isn't fireworks or champagne or some triumphant sprint toward a new beginning. No, it feels more like walking into a quiet room where the lights slowly rise, revealing a life you'd forgotten you were allowed to have. And that's exactly how it felt on my first morning at Titanforge. My new office sat on the 52nd floor, surrounded by sweeping glass that caught the first touch of daylight. The sun poured across my desk in long, warm stripes, illuminating the new engine I was rebuilding cleaner, faster, unburdened by the compromises ApexFort forced on me. For the first time in years, the code felt like mine again. Every line I wrote carried a sense of freedom I almost didn't recognize. Titanforge treated me not like an aging technician, but like the architect of a system that could reshape the defense tech landscape. The contract they offered reflected that respect: an 8-figure equity package and full creative authority. With an intellectual property clause I personally drafted, no loopholes, no traps, no one would ever own my work but me. Around mid-morning, I paused, leaned back in my chair, and let the sunlight warm my face. My phone lay on the desk, screen dark, but the reflection of my daughter's photo shone faintly on the glass. I picked it up, tapped her name, and this time, I didn't hang up. When she answered, her voice was hesitant at first, then soft, then warm. We didn't talk about the past. We just talked. And for a man who'd spent years losing everything that mattered, that single conversation felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. But nothing marked my rebirth more clearly than the industry's reaction. Within 60 days, Titanforge seized 40% of ApexFort's market share. Clients switched overnight, the Pentagon requested a briefing, and ApexFort, once arrogant, untouchable. ApexFort became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the defense sector. By the time the dust settled, people began asking me how it felt to take revenge. I always answered the same way. I didn't get even. I told them I just took back what was already mine. And that, more than anything, was the truth. I hadn't destroyed a company out of spite. I had protected the work I built, the dignity I lost, and the future I still had the right to claim. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's simple. You are never too old to start again, never too late to reclaim your worth, and never too small to challenge the people who underestimate you. Sometimes you don't need to shout or fight or break. Sometimes you just need to walk away with your head high and let the truth do the rest. And if my story resonates with you even in a small way, let me know where you're listening from. If you enjoyed this journey, a like, a comment, a share, or subscribing helps bring more stories like this to life, because somewhere out there, someone else is fighting their own quiet war, and your support helps them find the courage to rise again.